Today we're going to be talking about atomic structure. So we're first going to start out looking at subatomic and just the different parts of the atom. We're going to talk about writing symbols, ions, and isotopes today. So your protons and neutrons are in your nucleus. The electrons reside in what's called the electron cloud. Relative mass and charge, and the word relative is here because we're looking at the mass and charge relative to each other here. So the proton and the neutron are so much more massive than the electron that we say that protons and neutrons have relative masses of 1, and the electron has a relative mass of 0. So we know that no matter can have a mass of 0. So just make sure that you make clear to your students that this is a relative mass compared to these two other things. Also, charge is a relative as well. Protons are positive. I like to tell my students proton starts with a P, positive starts with a P. Okay, neutron, neutral, means no charge, so charge is 0. Electron, its charge is -1. Okay, so to work through this next thing, you're definitely going to need to get out your periodic table that you used from before, because you're going to need to be looking up some numbers. And so we want to start out with two vocabulary terms, atomic number and mass number. Atomic number is always equal to the number of protons in the atom, and the mass number is always equal to the number of protons plus the number of neutrons. If you think back to the previous slide with relative mass, where protons and neutrons each had a relative mass of 1, it should make sense then that our mass number, we would get to that by adding the two things that have relative masses. Okay? This is the symbol, the way you want to set it up. And so if you notice in this symbol, we have the chemical symbol here, symbol of the element. We have the mass number at the top. Again, that's protons plus neutrons. And we have the atomic number at the bottom. And so if you look on your periodic table and you look up carbon right now, what you should see on your periodic table is a 6. And depending on what kind of periodic table you have, these numbers could be in different locations. But the periodic table that I'm looking at, the symbol for carbon looks like this. Now, a lot of teachers want to say that the way we got this 12 is by rounding this number. This is not correct. Please do not do this. This number right here represents the average atomic mass. And this mass is actually an average of all the isotopes in existence for this element based on their relative abundances. Okay? So if you think about that, let's say we have atom Q. Okay, and atom Q has 2 isotopes. Let's say atom Q has one isotope that's Q10, okay, and the other isotope is Q12, okay, and let's say 50% are the Q10 isotope and 50% are the Q12 isotope. So when we would see our Q symbol on the periodic table, and let's say Q has an atomic number of 185, just to make up something, okay? So when we see our Q symbol on the periodic table, if we think about taking the average of the 2 isotopes, okay, based on their relative abundance, our average would be 11. Okay, and so if we use this number here, this 11, and say, okay, the way you get the mass number is just around that number, you would get a mass number of 11, but that wouldn't even match up to any of the isotopes that are actually in existence. Okay, so this number on the periodic table is an average, and it does not necessarily correspond to the mass of an isotope. And so when you're giving your students examples to work through, you need to give them enough information that they can get this mass number. They should never ever be rounding it from the average atomic mass on the periodic table, because it just simply is not correct. Okay? So please don't do that. Make sure you give them enough information to get this number. Okay. So let's work through some examples then. So if you look at this slide, this will be a nice slide to give your students. And as my students are initially coming into this, a neat hands-on activity that I do is from Flynn. It's called Atom in a Bag. So you know Flynn Scientific company. They have lots of good activities for teachers. So I'll just write that down for you. It's kind of a neat activity, make this a little more hands-on, a little more interesting. And it's kind of a cool model for the Atom too. You take a gallon size Ziploc bag, okay? Make sure you number it. So if you do several of these samples, I would number this one number 1. And then you have another smaller Ziploc bag. You would want to just number that too so you can keep them together. And you're going to get poker chips. And you're going to have usually red poker chip, white poker chips, and blue poker chips. And so you might see where this is going. These 3 poker chips will represent our protons, neutrons, and electrons. So this inner bag represents our nucleus because it's on the inside of our atom, the big bag. And so inside this bag, we would have our neutrons, which would usually be the whites, and our protons, which would be the blues. That's the way I have it set up. You can do whatever you like. And you can put as many in there as you want for the isotope that you're going to look at. And then you would take the electrons and put those in the outer bag because the electrons are on the outside. And then you can have lots of these little bags set up. Your students can go through the bags, come up with these numbers, these counts, and then start to give you the symbols. Just some things that we learned in this process. Make sure you make yourself a key as to what you have in your bags because sometimes they'll miscount, so you need something to sort of check it against. Also number both bags so that the students can't get them mixed up as they're pulling stuff out to count it. There's lots of different things you could do. I usually set mine up in stations, so I have at least one station where they get different isotopes, like I have a carbon-14 and a carbon-12, and I'll ask them questions about, of this whole group, which 2 are isotopes, how do you know? I also have it set up where they have ions or charged particles, and I'll ask them questions about that. So lots of different things you can do with this neat hands-on activity. So just to make sure we got this, so protons here, 3 for this example. So I'd have 3 blue chips in my inner bag. I would have 5 white chips in my inner bag, and we label the chips with positives for protons, 0 for the neutrons, and negative for the electrons, so I actually write that on there. And then I'd have 2 red on the outside for that bag. And you can go through that and have your students do it. So let's take a look here. Remember that protons always equals your atomic number. And so the protons are very important. They are what identifies the element. It's what tells you what symbol you have. So if you go to your periodic table and you look up element number 20, I'm pretty sure is calcium. I got to pull my periodic table back up. Yes. So number 20 on the periodic table is calcium, so you'd write Ca, like that. You would put your atomic number down here at the bottom, like this. Remember, mass number is going to be both of these things added together, so protons plus neutrons, so we do 20 plus 22, and that's 42. And I intentionally design my examples so that this mass number does not always match the average atomic mass on the periodic table. And so the average atomic mass of calcium is 40.08. So you want to design this or set this up so that it doesn't always match, because that's a big misconception that students have. Then to check charge, positives, negatives, so we look, equal, numbers. So since the positives and negatives are equal, we don't have a charge, so we don't write anything here, all right? And so we'll do the next one together too. So we get 8 protons. Remember, that identifies the atom. We look up number 8, that's oxygen. So we put our 8 down there. 8 plus 8, 16. Let's go here, 10 electrons. So now we have 8 positives, 10 negatives. You might have to help your students with this, with their negative numbers. So if we add them together there, we get a -2 charge, which we write here. So this is an ion then. And you can go through and try the next two on your own. Just pause your video for a second, and then we'll come back. Okay, so this symbol should be Li, 3, 8, plus 1, because you have 3 positives and 2 negatives, so your positive wins out. And this one should be 40, 20, calcium. And so just from doing 4 examples, we can look at ions and we can look at isotopes. So an isotope is when you have the same atom, but you have different numbers of neutrons, and therefore you have different mass numbers. And so you can see calcium 42 and calcium 40 are both isotopes of one another. This is an anion. Remember we talked about last class, or last video, is -2. And so it's negatively charged, makes it an anion. This is positive, so it makes it a cation of lithium. Okay, so just to recap, whenever you have same atomic number, different neutrons, that gives you isotopes. Okay, whenever you have a mismatch in protons and electrons, then you get ions. So protons, electrons, the charged particles mismatch, you get ions there. Atom in a bag is a great activity to get your students going with this. And you can give them, you know, little information. You can just kind of have them look at the bag, look at how would this represent the model of an atom, ask them some questions there. You could say, you know, look at the charges that we have on our poker chips. So what does that tell you about the particles? Since the blue poker chip has a positive, which particle do you think it is, and stuff like that. You can ask them lots of different questions as you go through there. And you can set up, you know, as many of these as you like. So with the atom in a bag model, basically we have a very simplistic model of our atom, and that model works for us because with the previous activity, we just wanted to get to how many protons, how many neutrons, how many electrons, can we write our symbol, do we understand atomic number, mass number, and charge. Okay, but then as we move forward, we want to look a little more in depth at these models of an atom. And so Thomson started out, discovered the electron. He had the plum pudding model. He thought that the atom was just a sphere of positive charge with negative electrons embedded throughout. Rutherford then came along, gold foil experiment, discovered that there was a central nucleus that was very massive, took up a very small amount of space, and that there were positively charged particles in that nucleus. So his model then showed a nucleus in the center with positive charges, and then the electrons were embedded on the outside. So still no movement going on until Bohr comes along. And so the Bohr model, even though it's not the accepted model anymore, it's really, really helpful to help students understand some of the things that are going on. It's really helpful to understand electron trends that we have for the periodic table. And so you need to talk about the Bohr model. And so the Bohr model, we don't really care too much about what's going on in the nucleus. So we don't really show the number of protons, the number of electrons there. What we're more concerned with are the electrons. And the reason we're concerned with the electrons is because the electrons determine reactivity, the electrons determine properties, and so that's what we focus our attention on from here on out. And so this is a pretty simple Bohr model. You can see that it's just made up of rings, so he thought the electrons were orbiting the nucleus in a circle here, and those were what he called allowed orbits. And as long as the electron stayed in that allowed orbit, it didn't lose energy. But electrons, he said, or he thought, could move within these orbits. And if an electron moved from, say, an inner orbit to a higher orbit, then that took energy. So you had to put energy in to make this happen. And then that electron was really unstable up there. It's in what they call an excited state. And so eventually that electron would come back down to either its ground state or another lower state. When that happens, then energy is released. And so this is what you see in fireworks. This is what you see when you do flame tests. Different atoms have different excitation energy changes, and so you get these different colors because for energy we have these equations. Energy equals Planck's constant times frequency, and speed of light equals wavelength times frequency. And so our energy difference for our transition would correspond to a certain frequency. Then that frequency would correspond to a certain wavelength. And so sometimes this is exhibited in colors that we can see, like reds, greens, blues, and so on. So that's what's happening there. But we can use this Bohr model then to kind of explain some atoms and start talking about where their electrons are. So we're going to start out really, really simple, and we're going to start out looking at hydrogen. So if you look at hydrogen, and remember again, we're only concerned with the electrons. So hydrogen is the first element on the periodic table, has one proton, and it's a neutral atom, so it's going to have also one electron. And if you look on your periodic table, you should notice that hydrogen is in the very first row. Because hydrogen is in the first row, we can give it one orbit, or n equals 1. And then since hydrogen has one electron, we can show that just by drawing a dot right here. So this would be the Bohr model for hydrogen. It's got one orbital contains, or one orbit for the Bohr model containing one electron. And we can kind of go up further than that. Let's go to lithium. So if you notice on your periodic table, lithium's in the second row. And so to start my Bohr model, second row, I'm going to draw 2 circles. Okay? And then you look, lithium has 3 electrons. Okay? It's number 3 on the periodic table. That means the atomic number is 3, so 3 protons. Since it's neutral, 3 electrons. And you can actually start counting boxes now on your periodic table to help you figure out where to put your dots. So if you look on your periodic table, first row, you have hydrogen and helium. So you have 2 elements there. And so we're going to show 2 dots. So that's 2 of our 3. So 2 of lithium's electrons reside in the first, what's called energy level. Okay? Lithium has 1 more electron, and it has to go here. And so you put it to the next level. And so only 2 electrons are able to reside in this n equals 1 energy level. And we'll talk about why that is in just a second. Let's jump forward a good bit to fluorine. And so if you look at fluorine, I think it's number 9. Yes. Let me just double check. Yeah. So fluorine's 9, so that means it has 9 electrons. Fluorine is still in the second row though, so we draw 2 circles. So there's my nucleus in the center. Circle 1, n equals 1. Circle 2, n equals 2. Only 2 electrons can fit in the first level. And so we've used 2 of the 9, so we have 7 left. So we're going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Put our dots in. And so now if you look at fluorine and lithium, we can start talking about some differences that these things have. So if you look at lithium, and here's another vocabulary term called valence electrons. These are the outer electrons. And so if you look, here's our outer shell. It's the second shell, or second energy level, and we have 1 valence electron. Whereas if you look at fluorine, the valence or outer shell, you can also call it energy level, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 electrons there. And you can just keep going, okay? If you wanted to draw the Bohr model for potassium, you could. Potassium's in the 1, 2, 3, 4th row. And so since potassium's in the 4th row, you'd have to draw 4 circles. Bohr model sort of breaks down a little bit once you get into your transition metals, just because of the d orbitals. We'll talk about those in a little bit. But for the first 3 rows of the periodic table, this is great. It's very simple. Students understand, and it's a good way for students to start looking at size differences of atoms. It's a good way for students to start looking at how many electrons are in the outer shell of these atoms. And so this is just another model that we have to kind of keep going with our description of the atom. Okay, so now let's get over to the next, or the quantum model. So this is the accepted model right now for the atom. This is called the quantum model, or the electron cloud model, you may have heard. And so a couple of vocabulary shifts. With Bohr, we're talking about orbits, and with quantum model, we're talking about orbitals. Okay, so Bohr's model was very keen on location of the electron. You know, what shell is it in? This model is more focused on the energy of the electron. In fact, the Heisenberg uncertainty principle says that we have no way of telling exactly the momentum and the position of the electron at any time. We're more concerned with the energy of that electron. And that's why you see these kind of funky pictures here, because, and this is where the word cloud starts to come in, because we're not really sure, can't really tell where the electron is, but we can give it a probability distribution. And so in this orbital, the electron is probably, 98% of the time here. But at any one time, it could be up here, down here, over here. Okay, so this little sphere that we have, it's supposed to be three-dimensional, represents the probability space of where the electron could be. And so you'll see these orbitals have different names. They have S's, like this is showing you. You also have P's, B's, and F's. And based on these different orbitals, you get different shapes. And these orbitals represent where the electrons are most likely. Okay, so these are probability distributions. So I'm going to show you a few more pictures. This represents a p orbital. This is really what the probability distribution would sort of look like. You see how fuzzy it is. You see it's a lot darker here. So this is area where it's more likely to be. As it gets lighter and lighter, there's less probability there. And so then these pictures represent all three different kinds of p orbitals, and those would actually overlay, so you get this pretty little flower kind of configuration here. So this is what a p orbital looks like. And then this is what a d orbital looks like. And so notice for S, there's only one type. All S's are spheres. For P, there are three types, the different lobes and the different configurations. For D, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different types. Okay, so that's important. We're going to kind of come back to that in just a minute. And so this is kind of a blow up of what a quantum model would look like. And hopefully looking at this, you can see why we tend to just use Bohr. Bohr is really simple. You draw a bunch of circles and fill in your dots based on how many electrons you have. Quantum model, we're trying to draw and represent in 3D. So if you see right here, this is your 1s orbital. So to Bohr, that would represent that first circle. And so this 1s orbital could contain only 2 electrons maximum. And then you see here's the 2s orbital, so it's a little bit bigger sphere, but just overlaid onto the first one. Okay, so this would be like that second circle for Bohr. Only 2 electrons fit there though. So think back to fluorine, we actually had 9 electrons in that second circle, only 2 fit here. So P, you see all these red, that has to be also in the second shell. And we know this because of the 2. You see this? And so 1s, first energy level or first shell, it's an S type, so we get a small sphere, 2 electrons fit in. Second shell, here and here, so we have a 2s and a 2p. And so we have a little bit bigger sphere, and then our p's, which are the weird lobes. And so we can fit 2 in this sphere. We can fit 2 here, 2 here, and 2 here. So that's a grand total of 8. So at the max, you can get 8 electrons in your valence. And then if we continue on and keep filling more electrons, we go up again. So we get a 3s, 3p, and so on and so on. And you just keep going and expanding. This would be almost impossible for students to draw, but this is really what they think the atom is kind of looking like now. So that brings us to electron configurations. In electron configurations, you want to now take your periodic table and do some more notations on it, and this will help you. You may want to use a colored pen or something like that. These first 2 columns on your periodic table, we're going to label those S's. And then notice our numbering convention. Hopefully you can see how that's working out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It's just the number, the row number there. Helium is still an S, so you need to make note of that. Then you have your P's, which would be boron all the way over to neon. So that whole block, you would want to block out a certain color. Our transition metals are our D's. And then the lanthanide and actinide series are our F's. We won't go there today probably, but we do want to start kind of looking at this. And so we're going to start writing these electron configurations. You may want to take the time right now and just pause your video so that you can get your periodic table labeled. And this is going to be sort of hard to do just on a video, but I'm going to try my best to make sure this makes sense. So first we want to get some terminology out of the way. Electron configuration and orbital diagram are the two things that we're going to be working on today. So electron configuration describes where electrons are in individual atoms, and we're going to look at S, P, D, F orbitals here and start writing these out. An orbital diagram is a drawing of the electron configuration. These things usually only show the valence or outer electrons because it's just too much to draw. The first that we start will draw all of it. So electron configuration and orbital diagrams. This is going to be letters and numbers, and this is going to be boxes and arrows. Okay. So we have to know the 3 rules before we can proceed. And so the Aufbau principle says that you have to build up. Aufbau is actually a German word meaning building up. And all this means is that you fill the lowest energy shells first. So you fill shell 1 or energy level 1 first, then go to number 2, and so on and so on. You fill S before you fill P, and so on. Hund's rule says electrons fill orbitals evenly before pairing. I'll talk about this some more when we draw the orbital diagrams. Pauli exclusion principle says no 2 electrons can have the same set of quantum numbers. And we'll talk about quantum numbers in just a bit. So what that means for orbital diagrams is that 1 electron has to spin up in an orbital and 1 electron has to spin down. So I'm going to go back to my periodic table right here. So we're going to write a few of these electron configurations. Hopefully you'll catch on to the pattern. We're going to start, of course, with the simplest atom on the chart, and that's hydrogen. The way you do an electron configuration is you locate the element. Hydrogen will be right here. And then you're just going to basically name each box that you come to and write it down. And so this is hydrogen's box on the periodic table. We see that it's in row number 1, so we write 1. We see that it's in the S block, so we write S. And we count 1 box, so we write a little 1, superscripted like that. What this means, so let's break this down. Hydrogen has 1 electron, so this 1 represents 1 electron. Where is the electron? It's in an S orbital. And remember we said S orbitals are spheres. And what energy level is it in? It's in the first energy level. So hydrogen's 1 electron is in an S orbital, and it's in the first energy level. Okay, so let's try to move on to one that's a little more complex. We'll go to lithium. Okay, so lithium is right here on our periodic table. So to get to lithium, we have to get lithium's box on the periodic table plus all the boxes that lead up to lithium. So we basically have to name these 2 boxes and this box right here. And so you look, these 2 boxes, hydrogen and helium, are in the first energy level. They're both S's, and how many are there? 1, 2. So our first thing we would write is 1, S, 2. And then we come down to the next thing. So almost like you're reading a sentence. So this box, this one. So this box is no longer in the first row. It's in the second, so we write a 2. It's still an S though, and we only count 1 box on this row. So we'll write 2 for second row, S for still an S, and 1 because we only counted 1 box to get to lithium. And so now let's break down what this means. These little numbers here superscripts represent your number of electrons that you have. So 2 plus 1 means lithium has 3 electrons. That is correct, okay? The first 2 of lithium's electrons are in the first energy level in an s orbital. Lithium's final electron is in the second energy level. It's also in an s orbital, okay? And let's move on and let's do neon. So for neon, which is all the way over here, okay, we got to get all the boxes leading up to neon. So you should start to see a pattern. We're going to get this box and this box. They're both in the first row. They're both S's. There's 2 of them. So 1s2. These 2 are in the second row. They're still S's. 1, 2. So we go 2s2. And then we move over to the pink boxes, okay? Those are not S's anymore, but they are still in the second row. So we write the 2. Now we've moved to a different type of orbital, that's P. And to get to neon, we count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we get a 6, like that. So this is neon. And so you can kind of look at it. How many electrons does neon have? 2 plus 2 plus 6, that's 10, okay? Neon's first 2 electrons are in the first energy level in an s orbital. Neon's valence electrons, okay, second shell, right, second energy level. How many valence does neon have? It has 2 plus 6, that's 8. And you may have heard the octet rule. And so this is a full valence shell for neon. And that's why those elements in that column are called noble gases, because they have full valence shells and they don't react. Okay, so this is electron configurations. We can do some D's too. The only thing different about the D's, if you'll notice how this says 4s, okay, 4th row. But then if you look at the D, it doesn't say 4D, it says 3D. And so you have to remember to drop your energy level there. All right, so we can draw some of those out, but I think right now we'll just kind of stick with the simple ones. So let's move forward then and look at some orbital diagrams. Okay, so if you look at S, there are 2 columns. And so an s orbital is going to only hold 2 electrons. And so for our orbital diagram, we're going to show an S as having 1 box. Okay, so that's going to represent our sphere. You know, we don't want to draw in 3D, so we're just going to draw a box. It's so much easier. P, if you think back to our pictures, we had 3 different types of P's, right? And look over here at P. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 columns. 6 divided by 2 is 3. So 2 electrons fit into an orbital. And so how many does P have to hold all 6? It would have to have 3. So you're going to draw 3 boxes for P like that. D, if you count, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So how many boxes will we have? We'd have 5. If you go back to the slide where we had the picture, you'd see there's 5 different D orbitals. And then F, which we won't deal with, has 14, so there would be 7 there. So let's try to draw some of these. If you look at hydrogen, we have an s orbital. So all we draw is a box. And we can label it 1s. Okay? And then we're going to show our electrons in the box. And so how many electrons does it have? It has 1. And by convention, we draw electrons as half arrows. And the first one that you put in, you want to make it spin up like I have here. And so this is hydrogen's electron configuration. This is hydrogen's orbital diagram. It's just a different way to represent the electrons in the atom. Let's take a look at lithium. We'll do this one. So we have a 1s and a 2s. And so we want to draw 2 boxes. And ideally, I'm starting to run out of room, but ideally you'd want to show those boxes stacked up this way so that you can show that 2s is higher in energy than 1s. So I'm going to try that for the lithium. And so you could label it 1s, 2s, okay? And so here in the 1s we have 2 electrons. So Pauli exclusion says they have to have opposite spins, up, down, like that. In the 2s orbital or box as we have here, I'm only going to put 1, like that. And so these electrons are at lower energy and they're paired. this electron, this valence, is at a higher energy and it's not paired with anything, with another electron. And then we could do neon. Notice for neon, we have 1s, 2s, and a 2p. So to draw that all out, we'd have to draw our 1s, higher energy, our 2s, and even a little bit higher energy, our 2p. Okay, and we can fill in our arrows now. So we got 1s2, so up, down, paired, full, 2s2, up, down, paired, and then 2p6. Hund's rule says you put one in each box before pairing. So why do you think you'd put one electron in each box or each orbital before pairing up? So think about that. What type of charge do electrons have? They have negative charges, right? And so the analogy I'll use with my students is, you know, you're at home, your parents have you, and you're the only child, so you get your own room. And then they have another baby. And so that baby's not going to share your room. It's going to go into its own room, right? And so on and so on. So you only start pairing up or sharing rooms until you absolutely have to. And you do this because electrons actually repel one another because they're both negatively charged. So you can see here, and this is a good visual representation of the fact that neon is completely full. There's 2 electrons in each orbital. We represent by boxes. It's completely full. All the shells are complete there. And so that's how you would do an orbital diagram. Okay. At this point, when I kind of finish this lecture with my 9th graders, what I have them do is draw some representations of Bohr, the electron configuration, and the orbital diagram so they can see how they all sort of fit together. So that's a good visual for them to start to complete.